just sort of was just at home just going, oh my God, I've stuffed this up, I've hurt the career of people I care about. It's like it's an awful feeling losing an election campaign, but also probably one of the best things in terms of a learning experience, because you learn far, far more from your mistakes than your wins. Like, I think all of us involved in that rewrote that campaign in our heads a million times, and to be honest, the result was kind of the same.
By 2012, Dee Madigan had more than a few wins under her belt. Awards from her successful career in advertising and a regular spot on the ABC TV show grew in transfer. But something was missing. She'd been living a kind of dream life in advertising, shooting big budget campaigns all around the world, from the white sandy beaches of Vietnam to dusty pink sunsets in Los Angeles. It was Dee's job to have ideas, flashes of inspiration that would make you buy Coke instead of Pepsi. But gradually, the itch to use her talents for something much bigger grew. And then she got a call from the Queensland Premier that changed everything. I'm Kelly Reardon, and this is Curveball. And look, this conversation is a masterclass in how to craft and how to control your message. Dee, you built a fairly formidable career in the perfectly respectable world of regular advertising. How did you end up then in political advertising?
I grew up with politics in my family. That my parents were big into politics. It was always a discussion at the table. I joined the Labor Party when I was 18. So that was always something I was interested in, and I was working in advertising. Not particularly happily. It was a lot of fun for a couple of years, as advertising can be. But I sort of got to this point where I was writing political commentary for newspapers, doing political commentary on TV, and doing advertising, which was sort of paying the bills. And at that time, I was working from home with a couple of small kids and whatever. And then I got the opportunity to combine them, if you like. I got a call to say, would I be interested in the Queensland election campaign, because they'd actually they'd watched Gruen and thought, oh, Todd sounds like he's a good creative, and people don't realise Todd's actually a planner, not a creative. And he said, Dee's probably the person you might want to talk to for that. And the State Secretary, who's now Senator Anthony Chisholm, came to Sydney. We had a chat about it, and I said, yeah, that sounds like fun. Let's do that. And I did that, and we got smashed. But for me, it was a little bit like heroin. Well, I assume like heroin. I've never tried heroin. But it was sort of like there's something really addictive about that. And for the first time ever, when you get that point, and it's an amazing feeling where for the first time in your life, you feel like you're doing exactly what you should be doing. Like, I always wanted to write. Like, I knew that's from when I was a little kid. Like, that was all I ever wanted to do, but not sure how it kind of looked or felt. And then doing election campaigns and that spur of the moment thing and thinking quickly and working with words and understanding strategy. It was like, I can do this. I can do this. So it was a really, really good feeling.
This 2012 Queensland state election campaign was really quite rough for you and for the Premier Anna Bligh. Can you take us inside that campaign?
Well, I was coming up from New South Wales, and in New South Wales, everyone was like, oh my God, we all love Anna. And I actually do love Anna. But in Queensland, it was different. The Labor Party had been in for such a long period of time. And what happened was they won the election in 2009 that they probably shouldn't have. Sometimes there's just a cycle to elections. And what happens when you win an election you shouldn't? People pick up the baseball bats next time, which is why I probably got the gig, because anyone with half a brain said no, because they could see what was going to happen. Like, we were always going to get smashed. But we were sort of, looking for ways around it. And there was some stuff with Campbell Newman when he was mayor, some dealings with his family, I think one of whom has, been in quite a bit of trouble recently. So we weren't completely off the mark about some of the sort of dealings that went on. And look, it worked for a little while. It worked quite quickly, and we started clawing back some votes, and I was excited. I was like, oh, this is working. And Cheers said, oh, it's too soon. I don't think we can sustain it. Like, there's a real pace to an election campaign. You've got to hit certain points at certain things. And he was correct. It worked a little bit too well too quickly. So Campbell Newman got investigated by the Crime and Conduct Commission, and we thought, oh, that's great. So we made some ads saying it's so bad he's being investigated by the Crime and Conduct Commission. And then I still remember it was a Friday afternoon, and I was about to head home for a night at home with my children, and I got a call going, he's just been cleared. And it was just like this moment of all these ads we had ready to run on that weekend, and it was just like, oh God, do we keep them running? Do we pull them? We didn't have something to replace them. It was just anyway. We let the ads run, and it was the result was exactly as you'd expect. Bad, and then we then were still trying to claw back votes, and we decided maybe the strategy could be, like, we knew we were going to lose, don't give them too much power, because we thought maybe memories of Bjelke-Petersen, and there was people from New South Wales advising us saying, oh, we ran that campaign in New South Wales and it worked a bit, and it was like, yeah, but they had a year to prosecute it, so I had to get poor Anna to do these ads saying, don't give him too much power. And I had to leave the room. I was in tears. Anna's a pro. She can look down the thing and the funny, well, not funny thing about that was all the members in the party were really angry because they thought we'd given up. And in fact, we were doing that because we hadn't given up. We were actually still trying to claw back votes. What we should have done is just run Labor achievement ads, because you do need to think about how your own party members are going to feel. And I think we'd sort of, in our desperation to sort of see if we could salvage anything, just kept going. So it was, it was pretty brutal, and just going from that feeling of just hyper 6 weeks of intense to all of a sudden being back in Sydney. Everyone else was going on. Anna went overseas. Jackie Tradd, who was the Assistant Secretary, went straight into a by-election for Anna's seat. So Ches was working on that, and I just sort of was just at home just going, oh, my God, I've just ruined, I've stuffed this up. I've hurt the career of people I care about. It's like it's an awful feeling losing an election campaign. I cannot tell you how bad it is, but also probably one of the best things in terms of a learning experience, because you learn far, far more from your mistakes than your wins. Like, I think all of us involved in that rewrote that campaign in our heads a million times, and to be honest, the result was kind of the same.
You mentioned there that it was such a crushing campaign loss for you personally. How did you rally after that?
I remember, like, at that time I had two still in nappies, I think, and one at primary school. So I dropped them off at daycare and primary school, and I would walk for sometimes 5 or 6 hours a day. It was absolutely, gutted in some ways, but it taught me to be a lot more resilient, and also to try not to get emotionally involved with the politicians as much. And I say this, so it's sort of weird that Anna Bligh and Jackie Tradd are two of my dearest, closest friends, and Anna's Chief of Staff today. And so it's sort of weird that I feel a bit guilty that out of this horrific loss, I got my pack, my absolute sort of pack of the people I care most about. But since then, I try to sort of keep a little bit of an arm's length, because you have to make really pragmatic decisions, and the relationship of the creative director needs to be with the campaign director, who's not the politician.
So that's your first time working on a political campaign. Have you always been a political person? Where did that interest come from?
I think growing up with Irish parents, politics was a big part of our home life. They weren't, like, TV wasn't really a thing. They hated TV, which was ironic given I ended up working in advertising. So we didn't even have a TV until my parents won one at the parish fete, and then it was only ever switched on for the news. So my whole life growing up was listening to the ABC radio. So that was kind of, my parents at dinner time talked about politics. A lot of it was Irish politics. My father came from a very political Irish family that were in, there was lots of fundraising nights for the poor people of Ireland, and the money, I'm pretty sure, wasn't going to food and clothes. Mm-hmm. Mum was less political in that she was also Irish, but my father was ostensibly middle-class Irish, in that his mum was a publican. He was educated. His sisters were all teachers. And so there is a thing about politics. It's a bit of a luxury sometimes to be able to be involved in politics, whereas my mum's family in a lot of ways were really poor Irish farmers who were just struggling to survive. So they came at it from different points of view. So like when they were both, had emigrated to Australia, whereas Dad was always pining after the good old days of Ireland sort of thing, whereas Mum was just happy to be in Australia, very much away from all that. So they were quite different, but they were both sort of very, very Labor. Except in his later years, we lost Dad to the Democrats, which was awful. He started wearing leisure suits and voting Democrats. It was so embarrassing.
And the party collapsed not long after. So can we draw these two things together? Who knows?
Yeah.
and he was a Catholic priest. So how did they end up married?
Well, she was one of his parishioners, I believe, and
wow.
Well, he was obviously not a very good Catholic priest, and she was obviously not a very good parishioner. And anyway, they sort of fell for each other, and it was sort of a long and convoluted thing where she went back to work in England, I think, for a while, and then he followed, and then she was pregnant. And once a baby appears, a dispensation comes fairly quickly afterwards. But it wasn't until I was probably 12 or 13, and I needed my birth certificate for some school thing. And it was only then, like when your dad had been a priest, as kids you hear a whole lot of, family stuff. But it was only when I looked at the birth certificate and did the dates. And I was just like, Mum, do you realise you were married 2 months after Fiona was born? And she just goes, oh, was I?
Who knew?
Didn't bat an eyelid.
So what kind of a life did they set up for themselves in Melbourne?
It was an interesting life. They had no money at the beginning, like they were really dirt poor. But my father had the gift of the gab, typical Irishman. They used to dig up plants from national parks and go around door to door selling them, telling them they were from a nursery. It's weird, my dad, for all his Catholicism, often thought that rules were great, but they may not actually have applied to him. Same with drink driving. Which is why I'm terrified of driving, because I spent my life with my father hooning down the road well over the limit. And then they had enough to rent a shop in Chapel Street, which is where a lot of antique shops were at the time. They used to go out to like deceased estates and you'd buy almost like the whole thing and sort through for like bric and brac kind of stuff. But both of them had a really good eye for antiques. And then Dad started specialising in desks, and Mum started specialising in hall stands. They had the hall stand and the desk and the house of desks next to each other, and they did well. We had a nice house. We still had the Kingswood station wagon. We went to Loreto Toorak. We were the only kids there, I think, with a Kingswood station wagon. And I do know in year 12 there was only 2 of us who voted Labor out of like 90-something. But it was ostensibly quite middle class. And then my father, he was a drinker, big drinker. And just started losing money by just doing dumb things like buying into a theatre restaurant. And when you've got a drinking problem, licensed premises are probably not the best things to buy. And he bought a hairdressing salon, having known nothing about hairdressing, and a racehorse. And slowly the money just sort of almost went to zero. And then he ended up buying a pub in the country on a whim, and then remortgaged it without telling Mum, and then left to go back to Melbourne, left her to run it. And by the time it was sold, it was worth very little. So they sort of went from having a bit of money to, by the time they died, having... I mean, I don't mean a little bit. They had nothing. And Dad hadn't filed a tax return in 10 years, so there was nothing.
So what was this like growing up for you and your siblings? What kind of a student were you?
I was a good student. I was an anxious student, but a very bright student. I did struggle a bit, like sort of in later years, my sort of marks sort of went into, I was going to say free fall a little bit. They didn't. I was always like, for me it was sort of getting down to a B when I should have been sort of sitting much higher than that. Was definitely a thing. I thought it was just because I was at that time living an incredibly insecure life. We'd moved to the country, and then I also I don't have a great concentration span, and that probably played a part in it. Now it's a thing and you can take drugs and stuff for it, but back then it wasn't. So I think that probably played out as well. But I was lucky enough that I was bright enough that, even on my worst days, I could still, pull a decent mark.
You did have to change schools at one point though.
We changed a lot. So started off at, St Mary's Catholic Primary School in Hampton till year 2, and then we went to Loreto from grade 3 through to year 8 or year 9 when we left there. When we moved to the country, there was a school called Nagel, which was the local decent Catholic school in Bensdale, but that was an hour away. So we went there only for one term. We were boarding with this woman. It was a horrible, horrible experience. And also it was a school that graded people on how hard they tried, not on how well they did. And for me, it was like, well, this isn't good. I'm kind of the opposite. And it was horrible and I hated it. And then we moved to the local state school, Swifts Creek High School, for a year, which was it was great in a lot of ways. There was, maybe 20 people in my class, if that. There was a couple of really good teachers. I had an amazing English teacher, but a lot of the kids were rural kids who, when shearing season was on, would disappear for 3 months. And the maths teacher admitted to me after a year that we'd got through exactly half the syllabus. So it was like, so I actually then went for a scholarship to MLC unbeknownst to my father. I was actually in a bus somewhere and saw it in a newspaper over someone's shoulder and thought, I'll apply for that. So I got it.
MLC is?
Methodist Ladies College.
It's a very prestigious private school in
Very
Victoria.
prestigious, yes. And they offered me a scholarship and my father was like, no, we'll send you back to Loretto. And then they rang up and said, we will give you the full boarding scholarship, like everything covered. And Dad said, no, back to Loretto. Now, Loretto didn't have boarding. And he didn't have any money. So, this was all about, no, I want my daughters to go to a Catholic school, which was just outrageous because at that point I wasn't even going to Mass. I still don't understand why you wouldn't want your daughter in a safe place where you're not paying any money for a good education. But anyway, we went back to Loretto and we boarded with a local family for a little while and that didn't really work out. And then with another family where it wasn't even family. I think it was a lady who saw it in some parish newspaper and it was just awful. And then in the end, we ended up just renting rooms. There was a pub in South Yarra called the Argo, which wasn't posh, even though South Yarra, it was pretty horrible. And my sister and I both just sort of had rooms there, which was just not conducive to study.
So the option of a private school education, fully funded, your boarding, you're looked after, it can allow you to flourish and thrive, being the good academic 16, 17-year-old that you are, versus this almost halfway house sort of style of living while you were trying to finish your senior schooling. I mean, how do you reconcile that now, or what do you think would have been different for you had you gone to MLC?
Oh, well, I think my HSC marks would have been significantly better. Look, part of it might have been that because, my younger sister wouldn't have got in, so maybe it was keeping us together. But if that was the case, Dad was living in Melbourne at the time. At no point did he say, well, why don't I look after you? He literally just didn't suggest that. So he was just, the priesthood is a terrible training ground for fatherhood. He was kind of selfish with stuff like that. So maybe that was his thinking, I don't know, or maybe it was, no, she has to go to a Catholic school. But MLC was just as prestigious as Loretto, so I don't really understand that, and I wish Mum or someone had put their foot down on that one and said no.
So you finished school and you probably thought, okay, I'm through these tough times. I've got myself through somehow. But then at 18, another bit of a curveball of sorts. Yeah,
well, Mum died. I think she was diagnosed with lung cancer just before I was 18 and then died when I was 18. So that was all pretty grim. We had lived together briefly as a family, only for about, I think it was about 6 months, just in a rented house. And then Mum decided she could not deal with lung cancer and my father. And plus we had no income because he wasn't making any income. So she rented a little room in Sandringham that was a shop at the front. And she went back to doing sort of the bric-a-brac thing of sort of just buying antiques and selling them. And she lived out the back with my little sister. There was a cafe 2 doors down that had a couple of rooms above it. So I rented that and lived there and then until she died. And then I just moved into share houses and stuff like that.
And then not long later, I understand your father passed away as well. So this must leave quite the burden on you to kind of raise everybody.
When Mum died, it was tricky because she'd made me executor of her estate, not Dad. So there was a lot of tension there. But as I said, there was not much of an estate, so that was okay. And there was my sister, but she was in Byron, I was in Melbourne, but the other 2 were in boarding school. And so there wasn't a great deal to do for them. I mean,
find the fees?
Well, I just didn't pay them because I was executor of the estate and I didn't have the money to pay them. So I just took a punt that Catholic schools wouldn't kick out orphans. And look, to be honest, I reckon I reckon Dad probably never paid the Loretto fees as well. It was exactly the sort of thing Dad would would do. He was pretty shufty with things like that. And he might have negotiated a thing for them taking me back based on the fact that I got into MLC. And also when I was at Loretto, I was in a special gifted children's program. So they probably thought it was a good move because I would boost their HSC marks. But, gee, that didn't happen.
You eventually make your way north to Sydney. It's a sort of a new start for you. What did you do when you first got there?
Well, I went with a fella I was with at the time, and he just said, do you want to just move? And I wanted out. So I was like, yeah, sure. And it was quite easy for me to transfer to Sydney Uni because the head of education at Sydney Uni was an ex-Loretto girl. She's like, oh, well, yeah, it's no problems. Don't worry if they're not the same courses, Like, okay, fair enough. So I was at Sydney Uni and working because I had no money and I was on the orphans allowance for Austudy. I didn't get that uni experience. Like people like, oh, did you get in politics at uni? It's like, no, I joined. But again, sort of getting involved in like, people said like the law review or drama, because I've always liked that sort of thing. And you're working like to literally just pay your rent. Sydney rents are really expensive. They weren't as bad then as they are today, but it was really, really tough financially. But luckily, I never thought about not doing a degree. And that was the one thing about the schooling I had, was it never occurred to me that you didn't go to uni. My first course was a Bachelor of Business in Property because I knew I wanted to write. I toyed with journalism. I got into journalism and then I thought, I'm so tired of being poor. So I thought I'll get into property and I'll make $1 million and when I'm 40, I'll retire and write the great Australian novel. And then I did a year of this course and thought, I'm going to kill myself if I have to keep doing this. So I switched to teaching because it's just, English teaching sort of, it's an enjoyable course to do because it's mostly an arts degree with some education subjects. But then I taught for a year at Fort Street High in Sydney, which is a selective high school. So it is as good as it gets from a teacher's point of view. And I knew absolutely then this is not what I wanted to do. And that's how I got into advertising. I was working at a pub at the same time because all the ad people used to drink there. And they talked about, why don't you do advertising? And I was like, nah. And then I just one day decided to do this course and graduated in the top 10, so I got a placement, and that's sort of how I got into it, I guess.
Dee Madigan is one of Australia's leading political communicators, and you're about to hear about where she learned the dark art of persuasion during the wild west of commercial advertising in the 1990s. That's next on Curveball. Dee Madigan's just landed in Sydney after a turbulent childhood in Melbourne. And she's found herself drawn to the big personalities and the even bigger budgets of the advertising business. Dee, what was your first job in advertising like?
My first job in advertising was so much fun. When you're a creative, advertising is for people like me whose brains are all over the shop. When you're a creative, they give you your office, they give you a foosball table, they give you literally toys to play with, and then you have other people to do the grown-up stuff. You have producers to make sure things go on time and on budget. You have suits who have to deal with the clients and the everyday stuff. You get the fun stuff. You just have to be able to come up with ideas, and I could do that. So it was fun. The problem with advertising is it treats the creatives like little kids, which is fantastic, but then it tends to throw people out when they're 40. So you get all these basically people who've got no business ideas, who've just sort of been behaving like children for 20 years, and all of a sudden they're unemployable because then the ad industry goes, where's the next bunch? So look, it was so much fun for years. And the budgets are huge. You'd sort of, like, I used to have to get to do tampon advertising because if you're a female in an ad industry and there's a tampon brief, it's coming to your desk. And then, but also the clients were insistent that it had to be a chick in a bikini, a white bikini on a beach. So I used to spin the globe and pick a beach overseas and then write the ad, and the client would be happy because I go on the shoots as well. So, like, I used to just travel around the world, and there was lots of long lunches. Like, all the stereotypes you hear about advertising
are true.
Are actually based in a little bit of truth as well. And So it was fun. It was really fun for a lot of years. But then eventually, after the first couple of times of doing a great ad or winning an award or doing that sort of thing, you start to think, is this it? And then I got to the point where I'd be in meetings with clients and they'd be, spending half an hour discussing whether a font should be 12 points or 14 points. And I would just be sitting there going, oh, fuck, this is, I can't take this seriously. I don't care. That would be my answer. I don't fucking care. And I thought at that point you start to think, all right, Dee, all right, what's next? But I stayed in it for probably longer than I wanted to because as women do, you get to a point where you want children. So if you're past 6 years at a place, when maternity leave kicks, all those things you take into account. So I waited until I was about 8 months pregnant and the agency, they were doing a round of redundancies and they said, look, it's up to you. It's a voluntary redundancy. It's entirely your choice as they waive a 6-figure check. And it's like, just hand me the money. So that was pretty good. And then I realised after Queensland what I liked doing was political, and I'd always liked behavioural change stuff anyway. So I just sort of made a really conscious decision that I wanted to do something I really loved doing. But I was sure that it was actually economically sensible as well because there was nothing in this space. There was a lot of well-meaning people, but they didn't have the skills from advertising. So all the dark arts that I'd learned were actually really helpful.
So you start thinking about your own brand and possibly a company on your own. And amid all this, you're starring on ABC TV's The Gruen Transfer alongside advertising gurus Todd Sampson and Russell Howcroft. How were you chosen to be a panellist?
Gruen probably changed everything for me. That is absolutely true. For some reason, people think that if you're on TV and you say something, you're sort of, more than someone who's not on TV and says something, and which is, by the way, complete bullshit, but I'm happy to, profit from it. But I was the only person, I think, who did not put their hand up to try out for Gruen. So my boss at the time did. I was doing 3 days a week at an agency and he applied and they needed someone to do the pitch segment for the pilot episode and he said to me, can you do that please? And I was like, yes, boss. So I did that and Gruen rang me and said, would you audition for the panel? So that is how that happened, and there is no doubt that my whole then career from that was because of Gruen. So when, like Queensland, when the election campaign came up and then Todd suggested me and that was kind of how it worked. It like in politics, though, it's been in some cases a little bit of a, oh, no, she's just after fame, not after the sort of, not a true believer. And it's like, well, I've been a member since I was 18 and honestly, you wouldn't do this. You wouldn't do political advertising for the money. Or for the fame. It is hard work, but so Gruen is absolutely the reason that I have the career I have now.
And do you think you were able to cut through as a panellist because you are so well trained in have something to say it quickly, say it in a story, craft your message? Like basically what your job is to model all the things that you've been telling clients to do.
My father was really big on public speaking, like to the point where he'd make us do it over and over again. And I think, why? Terribly grateful for that today. But if you look at my first season of Gruen, I'm pretty sure based on my first season, they would never have had me back. Like now we audition people each year and bring in new people, but we didn't do that for quite a few years. Thank heavens, because I wasn't very good. You get better because you watch yourself back and you learn how to improve. And probably going on Sky was actually really good training for that because it was usually me against 3 right-wingers. So having to be across things, think quickly and respond quickly, that was actually very good training for that as well. But, yeah, no, I wasn't naturally good at TV. I don't know that I'm naturally good at anything. I do work really hard at stuff.
And tell us about then launching Campaign Edge. How hard was it for you, a female in a fairly male-dominated industry, to launch a company of your own, secure the work and build it?
I was lucky because I was doing it in a really small field. And I'd been thinking about starting an agency anyway, and I'd been in talks with another company, and they'd been faffing around for about a year. And I mentioned to Ray Smith, who owns one of the owners of Cutting Edge, I said, this has come up, and she reckons, I should be doing it under a company name. And I've been thinking about starting an agency anyway. And he said, we'll back you. And it was just like that. I think he had the lawyer's papers drawn up the next day. And I thought, well, I'll call it Campaign Edge, which is close enough too. And I thought Ray's being lovely. He's also a very smart businessman, because I'm sure we've done very well ever since. So he's been good. So that was our Queensland 2015 was our first election campaign, which was good for the company because it was a massive win, and it was winning the one that no one thought we could win. And it's actually, we haven't lost one since too, so which is nice. Like I had done the 2013 federal election campaign, but to be honest, I didn't want to vote for Kevin at the end of it either.
Can you just lean in a little bit more there? You mentioned Ray, who wanted to back you in. I mean, that's even a difficult choice, whether to, accept a bit of capital and, give up a bit of a stake of your own company that you've been dreaming up. Was it a tricky decision for you, or because you had that relationship?
Not tricky at all. Yeah, occasionally you think, man, I'd like, more of the dividends, but I know what I'm good at, and I know what I am not good at. And the thing with the stuff that I'm not good at, it would actually stress me out to the point that I wouldn't be able to do the things I am good at. And with Cutting Edge, they had a back end in terms of accounts and things like that. And Ray has been in business a long time, so he's a really good sounding board. And the first thing we did was hire Stuart Gillies, who's my MD and my partner, and I think he's got the same shares as me now, was hire him because I'd worked with him in another company when we were working on the 2013 election, and he's really good at all the stuff I'm not, like which is dealing with customers, which is dealing with clients, which is money. Like we have, it's an ongoing joke in the agency, I'm not allowed to talk about money. I'm not allowed to agree to anything because I'll just be like, yeah, sure, we can do that. And Stuart will be like, well, no, we can't. Or they need this budget. So it's always like, no. So it's about knowing what you're good at and what you're not good at. Like if I'd been in charge of those things, we would not be 8 years down the track still going well. We'd be broke.
What do you think the other mark of your company is? How are you trying to differentiate to other agencies, other creative teams?
Well, I guess in the election space, that's sort of, there's not that many that play in that space. So it's knowing that. Having said that, the lessons you learn in the election space are actually really handy for your other clients as well, your brand clients and that, because you really learn with elections, you don't have a lot of money. So you really need to make sure the messages are only going to those who need to see them. So it's really funny in election campaigns. People are like, I haven't seen any of the ads. It's like, are you a swinging voter in a marginal seat? And they're like, no. And you think, good, we're not wasting our money then. So that kind of micro-targeting is really helpful in other areas as well. Like we're literally on the forefront, I think, of knowing how to get to people and our analytics. But then equally the stuff we do in brands and the learning there helps with the political. And in the behavioural change space, which I really like, so we do Amaze, which is the Autism Peak Body in Victoria, and Dementia Australia. I really like doing stuff where you feel it sounds silly, but making lives better. I like that. And union campaigns are fun as well because I think what I like about them is the amount of trust the clients have in us. Often with the big brands, you get people with marketing managers and things like that who will add in their, add value. With unions, they'll be like, all right, Dee, we want an ad that the Liberals are going to get screaming to get off TV the next day. And you go, okay.
Great brief.
And you do something. Yeah, literally that. And you go, okay. And then I did it, and Christian Porter described it as the most disgusting piece of advertising he's ever seen. And the client was like, perfect, Dee, perfect.
We'll put that on a T-shirt.
The downside is the budgets aren't great and I'll never be rich. But the upside is I get to work with people I really, really like. And I do stuff that I feel does make a difference. Like we're doing, the silicosis campaign at the moment to ban engineered stone. And you think, God, if that happens, that saves lives. That's really nice to do stuff like that.
And take me inside what it's like working on a political campaign day to day. And I'm really curious about how much of your work is driven by polling. There are so many market research companies that do that polling now. How much does that link up with your ads that are literally on the television, 2 days later?
Okay, so you start off usually a year before an election campaign. You'll start testing kind of territories of where you think your strengths and their weaknesses are. And there's no doubt we do focus on negatives. And I know people go, I hate negative ads. Why do you do them? Well, because they work. We're hardwired to notice negative information, and it's been proven to swing votes. But what I don't do is those sort of yellow and black, ads, because they've got no engagement and people just tune out. The logistics of that are pretty enormous, because you're talking to, trying to work out what the local issues are and the logistics of filming stuff. And you want to get as much overlay of the leader as you can, because in an election campaign, it's too hard to be shooting them. But then with Albo, we thought we had all that locked off, and then he lost all that weight. And when we were putting stuff together, you'd be showing stuff in groups, and the difference between bits of him in one bit and the other bit was so significant that that's what people started talking about. We're like, oh, my God, we're going to have to reshoot all these overlays. So January of 2022, which is just months before the election, I'm sort of having to traipse around Queensland with him, sort of just shooting as much stuff as we can, so that it matches. So that was fun. And then because the internet is a hungry beast, that's when you sort of want to make sure that we're always testing. Like every night in an election campaign, we're testing stuff. And focus groups get a really bad rap. Like you shouldn't obviously, design policies according to focus groups, but with advertising and stuff, it's actually really handy, because no matter how much you try to think like a swinging voter, you're not. And no one in politics is. We're not the target market. So just listening to them in rooms, and I've spent 10 years now of being in weird parts of the country, listening to people talk. It really does ground you in what works for them, and what the things they care about are as well. But during a campaign, we are every night in groups, and a campaign 6 from when it starts is you're up. I think the first meeting is 5:30. And you finish focus groups around 10:30 at night. So they are long, and then you get your polling sort of comes out every day at around, I think it's for the 5:30 or the 6 o'clock. And then you based on that, you're like, okay, this is a problem, or this is a problem, or this has happened in the news, and maybe we can capitalise on this, and trying to keep things on strategy as well.
I mean, this doesn't sound like there's a lot of time for you as a person and your family life, and you have children. How do you manage this intensity, which, is super intense for 2 months, but is also 12 months of a lot of hard work?
Yeah, look, it is tough on them. I think Queensland, particularly in 2012, because I think Josie was 18 months old, so Thomas would have been 24 months. There's 14 months between them. That was dumb. So that was, leaving sort of little kids at home was hard. I would try to get home every 5 nights for 2 nights was my thing. It's weird, though, when you're away, it's surprising how you just tune out because you're so focused on the campaign. NT was trickier. It's a trickier one because it's further away. So when I'm doing an NT election, like I'd fly home on the Friday, but
it takes a long time.
The flight home, it does, and the flight back from Sydney to Darwin direct is Sunday morning, and I didn't want to leave Sunday morning because then I'd only have one day. So I'd go Sunday night, and the only way to get back was to go via Melbourne. So it made for this incredibly long thing, but it meant I could have another day with the kids. And what I try to do as well is you get them up for a week if it's Queensland or NT, and that, and I promise usually a holiday for them afterwards. But after the federal, instead, I went to Europe with my girlfriends. So that's it. But federal actually is harder in a way because it was in Sydney, and it's sometimes easier being
locked
away
off
from them,
yeah.
And it's really hard because you're at home and they're there, and they think you can talk to them, but you're on focus groups. So you can't, and that's difficult. So what I would do is often, even though it was just in the city headquarters, I'd stay in a hotel 1 or 2 nights a week, just because those were the nights then I could just focus on that. But, look, it is pretty tricky on the kids, but I said I usually bribe them with the holiday, except after federal I treated myself instead.
We used to see these huge brands with even bigger budgets, betting it all on traditional TV and billboard advertising. Think, Britney Spears with Pepsi and Michael Jordan with Nike and all the big campaigns we've seen over the years. What's the modern equivalent of that? Are those big, huge multinational campaigns over in the social media age?
No, and I think it's funny. I think the more things change, the more they sort of go back to how they were. So when the internet first started, everyone got excited about data and micro-targeting and having loads of content for everywhere and splitting their budgets up into all this. And then they realised, like, shit content's just shit content. And they've created all this stuff that's not building their brand, or they've got influencers and it's building the influencers' brand and not theirs. And that's got less cachet as well now because everyone knows they're being paid to say stuff. Whereas this is one thing that I really like about TikTok. It's reminded people that stuff that's entertaining, that has an idea in it, gets shared. So a lot of the brands now are going back to, instead of spreading out everywhere, doing one clever idea, because a really clever TikTok video will get shared on Facebook, will get on Instagram. Like, video is still king. Like, we like that medium. And a good idea is still a good idea. So I think people just got a bit overexcited about the platform instead of the idea. And I think they're going back to that. And I think if you look at Super Bowl ads and things like that now, you see that the big brands are going back there a little bit, which is great.
And is that influencer piece, making it different as well? What we want to see on TikTok is sometimes an influencer doing something funny to promote a drink they love.
Yeah, and I think that is the key, is doing something funny. And this is where I think Instagram isn't as good as TikTok. With TikTok, there seems to be, they have more fun with it. And there's a bit of a risk with a product because you actually have to let them be a bit freer with it. But with Instagram, it's so posy. And the reality is we're 80% more likely to buy something if a friend recommends it. And that's the psychology behind influencers, that people kind of relate to them almost like a friend. But now it's so monetized and everyone's aware of that now, that they don't have that kind of influence anymore. And you just kind of know that they wouldn't be saying that unless, they were being paid to. So unless they make the content super interesting, it just doesn't have the cut through that it used to. And the good thing for people in advertising is influencers are generally not great at coming up with great ideas, because the people who do that actually work in advertising. So it's actually back to the point where advertising people are sort of almost doing up scripts for influencers, which is fine. But with brands, I always say to them, just be careful whose brand you are building here. Because it's a little bit like, I think it's a little bit like direct market TV, the old call this number now. It boosts immediate sales, but what it doesn't do is build your brand, and that's a longer, bigger problem for you.
The last question I have for you is somewhat related, Dee. What's the biggest challenge now in winning over people's opinions or winning over their buying power? What is it that changes someone's mind?
It's emotion, like always emotion. People make all purchasing decisions emotionally. So that's whether to choose to vote for someone or change their behaviour or whatever. And they do that to answer a need. And it's a need they have. And this is where brands stuff up, where they talk about what they do and not what that does for someone. And I think what happens is people inside the brand say they drink the Kool-Aid a little bit, and they're like, oh, our brand is so good and it does all these good things. So we saw that with, the Telstra campaign at the moment, for Australia. It's like, no, for your shareholders. And that's okay. So it's about, I think being honest, and reminding, I always say to brand people as well, because they always like, we want to have a relationship with our consumers. Like, people don't want to be best friends with the brand. They want how the brand makes them feel. And that has always been the case, whether it's online or anywhere else. So what need do they have that I answer? And I always say, it's not about you. And I always say this to politicians too. No one cares about you. They care about themselves. How do you make them feel? And that hasn't changed. That will actually never change. But sometimes people within brands forget that.
Congratulations on Campaign Edge, and good luck with it in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dee Madigan, the campaigner, author, advertising oracle and creative director of Campaign Edge on Curveball. Next time on Curveball, you'll meet Australia's favourite author, Trent Dalton. Find out how he's been able to find positivity and optimism after a somewhat troubled childhood full of violence and crime. How do you come out of a housing commission to become not only one of the best journalists in the country, but also a really nice and really positive guy.
It's pretty miserable, and the yard hasn't been mown forever because Dad doesn't like going out of the house, and everything just looks shit. You're looking out your window though, and you're seeing the beauty of this golden orb weaver spider.
But no one else would notice that, Trent. Seriously.
I don't know why I did. Just this idea of finding the beauty and finding the beauty in the not even the dark or anything, but just the mundane, and I really do love finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. And I think that did begin looking out the back window going, God, this is miserable. Like, this really sucks. There's got to be something beautiful around here.
It's such a joyful interview. I had a ball with Trent, so make sure you're subscribed to Curveball so you don't miss this episode. Curveball's produced by Dead Set Studios. This episode was produced by Grace Pashley. You can find out more at curveballshow.com. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yuggera people, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging.